Section 18. Quiquern, Part 2. Now the girl from the north had been lying near the lamp, eating very little and saying less for days past. But when Amoraq and Kadlu next morning packed and lashed a little hand sleigh for Kotuku, and loaded it with his hunting gear and as much blubber and frozen seal meat as they could spare, she took the pulling rope and stepped out boldly at the boy's side. "Your house is my house," she said, as the little bone-shod sled squeaked and bumped behind them in the awful Arctic night. "My house is your house," said Kotuku, "but I think we shall both go to Sedna together." Now Sedna is the mistress of the underworld, and the Inuit believe that everyone who dies must spend a year in her horrible country before going to Quadlipamiut, the happy place, where it never freezes and the fat reindeer trot up when you call. Through the village people were shouting, "The Torna has spoken to Kotuku. They will show him open ice. He will bring us seal again." Their voices were soon swallowed up by the cold, empty dark, and Kotuku and the girl shouldered close together as they strained on the pulling rope or humoured the sleigh through ice in the direction of the polar sea. Kotuku insisted that the Tornaq of the Stone had told him to go north, and north they went, under Tuktukjung, the reindeer, those stars that we call the Great Bear. No European could have made 5 miles a day over the ice rubbish and the sharp-edged drifts, but those two knew exactly the turn of the wrist that coaxes a sleigh round a hummock, the jerk that nearly lifts it out of an ice crack, and the exact strength that goes to the few quiet strokes of the spearhead that make a path possible when everything else looks hopeless. The girl said nothing, but bowed her head, and the long wolverine fur fringe of her ermine hood blew across her broad dark face. The sky above them was an intense velvety black, changing to bands of Indian red on the horizon, where the great stars burned like street lamps. From time to time a greenish wave of the northern lights would roll across the hollow of the high heavens, flick like a flag, and disappear, or a meteor would crackle from behind darkness to darkness, trailing a shower of sparks behind. Then they could see the ridged and furrowed surface of the floe tipped and laced with strange colours, red, copper, and bluish. But in the ordinary starlight everything turned to one frost-bitten grey. The floe, as you will remember, had been battered and tormented by the autumn gales till it was one frozen earthquake. There were gullies and ravines, and holes like gravel pits, cut in ice, lumps of scattered pieces frozen down to the original floor of the floe, blotches of old black ice that had been thrust under the floe in some gale and heaved up again, roundish boulders of ice, saw-like edges of ice carved by the snow that flies before the wind, and sunken pits where 30 or 40 acres lay below the level of the rest of the field. From a little distance you might have taken the lumps for seal or walrus, overturned sleighs, or men on a hunting expedition, or even the great 10-legged white spirit bear himself. But in spite of these fantastic shapes, all on the very edge of starting into life, there was neither sound nor the least faint echo of sound. And through this silence and through this waste, where the sudden lights flapped and went out again, the sleigh and the two that pulled it crawled like things in a nightmare of the end of the world at the end of the world. When they were tired, Kotuku would make what the hunters call a half-house, a very small snow hut, into which they would huddle with the travelling lamp and try to thaw out the frozen seal meat. When they had slept, the march began again, 30 miles a day to get 10 miles northward. The girl was always very silent, but Kotuku muttered to himself and broke out into the songs he had learnt in the singing house, summer songs and reindeer and salmon songs, all horribly out of place at that season. He would declare that he heard the Tornaq growling to him, and would run wildly up a hummock, tossing his arms and speaking in loud, threatening tones. To tell the truth, Kotuko was nearly crazy for the time being, but the girl was sure that he was being guided by his guardian spirit and that everything would come right. She was not surprised, therefore, when at the end of the 4th march, Kotuko, whose eyes were burning like fireballs in his head, told her that his tornaq was following them across the snow in the shape of a 2-headed dog. The girl looked where Kotuko pointed, and something seemed to slip into a ravine. It was certainly not human, but everybody knew that the Tornaq preferred to appear in the shape of bear and seal and such like. It might have been the 10-legged white spirit bear himself, or it might have been anything, but Kotuko and the girl were so starved that their eyes were untrustworthy. They had trapped nothing and seen no trace of game since they had left the village. Their food would not hold out for another week, and there was a gale coming. A polar storm can blow for 10 days without a break, and all that while it is certain death to be abroad. Kotuko laid up a snow house large enough to take in the hand sleigh, never be separated from your meat, and while he was shaping the last irregular block of ice that makes the keystone of the roof, he saw a thing looking at him from a little cliff of ice half a mile away. The air was hazy, and the thing seemed to be 40 feet long and 10 feet high, with 20 feet of tail and a shape that quivered all along the outlines. The girl saw it too, but instead of crying aloud with terror, said quietly, "That is Quiquern. What comes after?" "He will speak to me," said Kotuko. But the snow knife trembled in his hand as he spoke, because however much a man may believe that he is the friend of strange and ugly spirits, he seldom likes to be taken quite at his word. Quiquern, too, is the phantom of a gigantic toothless dog, without any hair, who is supposed to live in the far north and to wander about the country just before things are going to happen. They may be pleasant or unpleasant things, but not even the sorcerers care to speak about Quiquern. He makes the dogs go mad. Like the spirit bear, he has several extra pairs of legs, 6 or 8, and this thing jumping up and down in the haze had more legs than any real dog needed. Kotuko and the girl huddled into their hut quickly. Of course, if Quiquern had wanted them, he could have torn it to pieces above their head, but the sense of a foot-thick snow wall between themselves and the wicked dark was great comfort. The gale broke with a shriek of wind like the shriek of a train, and for 3 days and 3 nights it held, never varying 1 point and never lulling even for a minute. They fed the stone lamp between their knees and nibbled at the half-warm seal meat and watched the black soot gather on the roof for 72 long hours. The girl counted up the food in the sleigh. There was not more than 2 days' supply, and Kotuko looked over the iron heads and the deer sinew fastenings of his harpoon and his seal lance and his bird dart. There was nothing else to do. "We shall go to Sedna soon, very soon," the girl whispered. "In 3 days we shall lie down and go. Will your tornaq do nothing? Sing her an angekok song to make her come here." He began to sing in the high-pitched howl of the magic songs, and the gale went down slowly. In the middle of his song the girl started, laid her mittened hand and then her head to the ice floor of the hut. Kotuko followed her example, and the two kneeled, staring into each other's eyes and listening with every nerve. He ripped a thin sliver of whalebone from the rim of a bird snare that lay on the sleigh, and after straightening, set it upright in a little hole in the ice, firming it down with his mitten. It was almost as delicately adjusted as a compass needle, and now, instead of listening, they watched. The thin rod quivered a little, the least little jar in the world, then it vibrated steadily for a few seconds, came to rest, and vibrated again, this time nodding to another point of the compass. "Too soon," said Kotuko. "Some big floe has broken far away outside." The girl pointed at the rod and shook her head. "It is the big breaking," she said. "Listen to the ground ice. It knocks." When they kneeled this time they heard the most curious muffling grunts and knockings, apparently under their feet. Sometimes it sounded as though a blind puppy were squeaking above the lamp, then as if a stone were being ground on hard ice, and again like muffled blows on a drum, but all dragged out and made small, as though they travelled through a little horn a weary distance away. "We shall not go to Sedna lying down," said Kotuko. "It is the breaking. The tornaq has cheated us. We shall die." All this may sound absurd enough, but the two were face to face with a very real danger. The 3 days of gale had driven the deep water of Baffin's Bay southerly, and piled it onto the edge of the far-reaching land ice that stretches from Bylot's Island to the west. Also, the strong current which sets east out of Lancaster Sound carried with it mile upon mile of what they call pack ice, rough ice that has not frozen into fields. And this pack was bombarding the floe at the same time that the swell and heave of the storm-walked sea was weakening and undermining it. What Kotuko and the girl had been listening to were the faint echoes of that fight 30 or 40 miles away, and the little telltale rod quivered to the shock of it. Now, as the Inuits say, when the ice once wakes after its long winter sleep, there is no knowing what may happen, for solid floe ice changes shape almost as quickly as a cloud. The gale was evidently a spring gale, sent out of time, and anything was possible. Yet the two were happier in their minds than before. If the floe broke up, there would be no more waiting and suffering. Spirits, goblins, and witch people were moving about on the racking ice, and they might find themselves stepping into Sedna's country side by side with all sorts of wild things, the flush of excitement still on them. When they left the hut after the gale, the noise on the horizon was steadily growing, and the tough ice moaned and buzzed all around them. "It is still waiting," said Kotuko. On the top of a hummock sat or crouched the 8-legged thing that they had seen 3 days before, and it howled horribly. "Let us follow," said the girl. "It may know of some way that does not lead to Sedna." But she reeled from weakness as she took the pulling rope. The thing moved off slowly and clumsily across the ridges, heading always toward the westward and the land, and they followed, while the growling thunder at the edge of the floe rolled nearer and nearer. The floe's lip was split and cracked in every direction for 3 or 4 miles inland, and great pans of 10-foot thick ice, from a few yards to 20 acres square, were jolting and ducking and surging into one another, and into the yet unbroken floe, as the heavy swell took and shook and spouted between them. This battering-ram ice was, so to speak, the first army that the sea was flinging against the floe. The incessant crash and jar of these cakes almost drowned the ripping sounds of sheets of pack-driven ice driven bodily under the floe, as cards are hastily pushed under a tablecloth. Where the water was shallow, these sheets would be piled one atop of the other, till the bottommost touched mud 50 feet down, and the discoloured sea banked behind the muddy ice till the increasing pressure drove all forward again. In addition to the floe and the pack ice, the gale and the currents were bringing down true bergs, sailing mountains of ice snapped off from the Greenland side of the water or from the north shore of Melville Bay. They pounded in solemnly, the waves breaking white round them, and advanced on the floe like an old-time fleet under full sail. A berg that seemed ready to carry the world before it would ground helplessly in deep water, reel over, and wallow in a lather of foam and mud and flying frozen spray. while a much smaller and lower one would rip and ride into the flat floe, flinging tongues of ice on either side and cutting a track half a mile long before it was stopped. Some fell like swords, shearing a raw-edged canal, and others splintered into a shower of blocks, weighing scores of tons apiece, that whirled and skirted among the hummocks. Others again rose up bodily out of the water when they shoaled, twisted as though in pain, and fell solidly on their sides, while the sea threshed over their shoulders. This trampling and crowding and bending and buckling and arching of the ice in every possible shape was going on as far as the eye could reach all along the north line of the floe. From where Kotuko and the girl were, the confusion looked no more than uneasy, rippling, crawling movement under the horizon, but it came toward them each moment, and they could hear, far away to landward, a heavy booming, as it might have been the boom of artillery through a fog. That showed that the floe was being jammed home against the iron cliffs of Pilot's Island, the land to the southward behind them. "This has never been before," said Kotuko, staring stupidly. "This is not the time. How can the floe break now?" "Follow that," said the girl, pointing to the thing half limping, half running distractedly before them. They followed, tugging at the handsleigh, while nearer and nearer came the roaring march of the ice. At last the fields around them cracked and starred in every direction, and the cracks opened and snapped like the teeth of wolves. But where the thing rested, on a mound of old and scattered ice blocks some 50 feet high, there was no motion. Kotuko leaped forward wildly, dragging the girl after him, and crawled to the bottom of the mound. The talking of the ice grew louder and louder round them, but the mound stayed fast, and as the girl looked at him, he threw his right elbow upward and outward, making the Inuit sign for land in the shape of an island. And land it was that the 8-legged limping thing had led them to, some granite-tipped, sand-bleached islet off the coast, shod and sheathed and masked with ice so that no man could have told it from the floe, but at the bottom solid earth and not shifting ice. The smashing and rebound of the floes as they grounded and splintered marked the borders of it, and a friendly shoal rang out to the northward and turned aside the rush of the heaviest ice, exactly as a ploughshare turns over loam. There was danger, of course, that some heavily squeezed ice field might shoot up the beach and plane off the top of the islet bodily. But that did not trouble Kotuko and the girl when they made their snow house and began to eat, and heard the ice hammer and skid along the beach. The thing had disappeared, and Kotuko was talking excitedly about his power over spirits as he crouched round the lamp. In the midst of his wild sayings, the girl began to laugh and rock herself backward and forward. Behind her shoulder, crawling into the hut, crawl by crawl, there were 2 heads, one yellow and one black, that belonged to 2 of the most sorrowful and ashamed dogs that you ever saw. Kotuko the dog was one, and the black leader was the other. Both were now fat, well-looking, and quite restored to their proper minds, but coupled to each other in an extraordinary fashion. When the black leader ran off, you remember, his harness was still on him. He must have met Kotuko the dog, and played or fought with him, for his shoulder loop had caught in the plaited cotton wire of Kotuko's collar and had drawn tight, so that neither could get at the trace to gnaw it apart, but each was fastened sidelong to his neighbour's neck. That, with the freedom of hunting on their own account, must have helped cure their madness. They were very sober. The girl pushed the 2 shamefaced creatures towards Kotuko, and, sobbing with laughter, cried, "That is Quiquern who led us to safe ground. Look at his 8 legs and double head." Kotuko cut them free, and they fell into his arms, yellow and black together, trying to explain how they had got their senses back again. Kotuko ran a hand down their ribs, which were round and well clothed. "They have found food," he said with a grin. "I do not think we shall go to Sedna so soon. My Tornak sent these. The sickness has left them." As soon as they had greeted Kotuko, these two, who had been forced to sleep and eat and hunt together for the past few weeks, flew at each other's throat, and there was a beautiful battle in the snow house. "Empty dogs do not fight," Kotuko said. "They have found the seal. Let us sleep. We shall find food." When they waked, there was open water to the north of the beach of the island, and all the loosened ice had been driven landward. The first sound of the surf is one of the most delightful that the Inuit can hear, for it means that spring is on the road. Kotuko and the girl took hold of hands and smiled, for the clear, full roar of the surge among the ice reminded them of salmon and reindeer time, and the smell of blossoming ground willows. Even as they looked, the sea began to skim over between the floating cakes of ice, so intense was the cold. But on the horizon there was a vast red glare, and that was the light of the sunken sun. It was more like hearing him yawn in his sleep than seeing him rise, and the glare lasted for only a few minutes, but it marked the turn of the year. Nothing, they felt, could alter that. Kotuko found the dogs fighting over a fresh-killed seal who was following the fish that a gale always disturbs. He was the first of some 20 or 30 seal that landed on the island in the course of the day, and until the sea froze hard there were hundreds of keen black heads rejoicing in the shallow free water and floating about with the floating ice. It was good to eat seal liver again, to fill the lamps recklessly with blubber and watch the flame blaze 3 feet in the air. But as soon as the new sea ice bore, Kotuko and the girl loaded the hand sleigh and made the two dogs pull as they had never pulled in their lives, for they feared what might have happened in their village. The weather was as pitiless as usual, but it is easier to draw a sleigh laden with good food than to hunt starving. They left 25 seal carcasses buried in the ice of the beach, all ready for use, and hurried back to their people. The dogs showed them the way as soon as Kotuko told them what was expected, and though there was no sign of a landmark, in 2 days they were giving tongue outside Kadlu's house. Only 3 dogs answered them, the others had been eaten, and the houses were all dark. But when Kotuko shouted, "Ojo, boiled meat," weak voices replied, and when he called the muster of the village, name by name, very distinctly, there were no gaps in it. An hour later the lamps blazed in Kadlu's house, snow water was heating, the pots were beginning to simmer, and the snow was dripping from the roof, as Amarak made ready a meal for all the village, and the baby boy in the hood chewed at a strip of rich, nutty blubber, and the hunters slowly and methodically filled themselves to the very brim with seal meat. Kotuko and the girl told their tale. The 2 dogs sat between them, and whenever their names came in they cocked an ear apiece and looked most thoroughly ashamed of themselves. A dog who has once gone mad and recovered, the Inuit say, is safe against all further attacks. "So the Tornak did not forget us," said Kotuko. The storm blew, the ice broke, and the seal swam in behind the fish that were frightened by the storm. Now the new seal holes are not 2 days distant. Let the good hunters go tomorrow and bring back the seal I have speared, 25 seal, buried in the ice. When we have eaten those, we will all follow the seal on the floe." "What do you do?" said the sorcerer in the same sort of voice as he used to Kadlu, richest of the Tananaimea. Kadlu looked at the girl from the north and said quietly, "We build a house." He pointed to the northwest side of Kadlu's house, for that is the side on which the married son or daughter always lives. The girl turned her hands palm upward with a little despairing shake of her head. She was a foreigner, picked up starving, and could bring nothing to the housekeeping. Amaranth jumped from the bench where she sat and began to sweep things into the girl's lap. Stone lamps, iron skin scrapers, tin kettles, deerskins embroidered with musk-ox teeth, and real canvas needles such as sailors use. The finest dowry that has ever been given on the far edge of the Arctic Circle, and the girl from the north bowed her head down to the very floor. "Also these," said Kotuko, laughing and signing to the dogs, who thrust their cold muzzles into the girl's face. "Ah," said the Angekok with an important cough, as though he had been thinking it all over. "As soon as Kotuko left the village I went into the singing house and sang magic. I sang all the long nights and called upon the spirit of the reindeer. My singing made the gale blow that broke the ice and drew the two dogs towards Kotuko when the ice would have crushed his bones. My song drew the seal in behind the broken ice. My body lay still in the quaggy, but my spirit ran about on the ice and guided Kotuko and the dogs in all the things they did. I did it." Everybody was full and sleepy, so no one contradicted, and the Angekok, by virtue of his office, helped himself to yet another lump of boiled meat, and lay down to sleep with the others in the warm, well-lighted, oil-smelling home. Now Kotuko, who drew very well in the Inuit fashion, scratched pictures of all these adventures on a long flat piece of ivory with a hole at one end. When he and the girl went north to Ellesmere Land in the year of the wonderful open winter, he left the picture story with Kadlu, who lost it in the shingle when his dog sleigh broke down one summer on the beach of Lake Gletling at Nikosiring. And there a Lake Inuit found it next spring and sold it to a man at Imogen who was an interpreter on a Cumberland Sound whaler, and he sold it to Hans Olsen, who was afterward a quartermaster on board a big steamer that took tourists to the North Cape in Norway. When the tourist season was over, the steamer ran between London and Australia, stopping at Ceylon, and there Olsen sold the ivory to a Singhalese jeweller for two imitation sapphires. I found it under some rubbish in a house at Colombo, and have translated